Tragedy! Tragedy!
Macbeth, and Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, King Lear.
There's a fish there!
Before we begin our discussion of tragedy, let's take a quick look at how symbolic art influenced Shakespeare. Shakespeare and his buddies were very influenced by the medieval art. Medieval art was deeply symbolic. This means that it focused on universals by presenting them through particulars.
Don't worry. We'll give you some examples so you'll understand what we mean by symbolism, universals, and particulars.
Say we have a villain in a play, running around doing all sorts of bad stuff. Well, in a symbolic work of art, that villain wouldn't just be one bad guy. He would represent evil in the world.
This is symbolism in action. The universal is evil, and it's presented in the particular, the villain. Here's another way to think of it.
You know all those medieval and Renaissance paintings that have the saints with halos? We know we're not supposed to take that gold ring literally and wonder how it stays up behind the person's head. No, we take it figuratively, as a symbol of the saint's holiness.
In this case, the universal is holiness or goodness, and the particular is the saint with the halo.
In addition to good and evil, other universals are truth, beauty, justice, and purity.
Symbolism, in this case, is how universals are presented through particulars. How did Shakespeare use such symbolism in his plays? Well, there's that raging storm in King Lear. Okay, it is an actual storm, so that's the particular. Now, in a universal sense, it symbolizes the storm raging inside King Lear's mind, as well as the universe reacting to Lear's violation of moral order. That's symbolism a la Shakespeare.
Let's review. There are three main differences between Elizabethan drama and the drama we're used to today: the importance of words, real life versus stage life, and symbolism. The Elizabethan theater was a very word-oriented medium because theater companies didn't have a lot of fancy costumes, sets, props, scenery, or special effects at their disposal. That's why Shakespeare's plays are so word-heavy.
The second difference is what we call real life versus stage life. The characters in these plays are not real. They're what Aristotle described as illusions. This distinction between real life and stage life is sometimes blurred in our culture.
Symbolic art was very popular during the Elizabethan era. Symbolism is when the universal is presented through the particular, meaning that we have particular characters in a play that represent different universals, like good, evil, truth, and justice, for instance.
These are the differences between Elizabethan drama and our drama that you should keep in mind as you read Shakespearean tragedy.
Part 2. Tragedy.
Section A. What is tragedy?
Tragedy. We've been batting the word around a lot, but what exactly does it mean in our context? Like when we say, the play King Lear is a tragedy. Well, we mean that King Lear is a work of art, in this case, dramatic art, and its form is that of a tragedy. Though the play can be described as sad or depressing, because it's a great work of art, we can also describe it as intellectually enlarging, ennobling, and uplifting. Why is that?
Well, you know, real life is disordered and jumbled. But when crafting a tragedy or any drama, the artist can focus on the essentials of the story, consider causes and reasons, and make the experience of the tragic character our experience.
How does the playwright make the experience of the tragic character our experience? Through imagination, and in the case of Shakespeare, imagination is expressed through, you guessed it, language. This is some pretty heavy stuff, but let's put it all together.
Tragic figures are noble figures who are somehow better than we are. They suffer a reversal of fortune and recognize the consequences of their actions. And in art, a tragedy is the imaginative depiction of the tragic figure, which moves the audience to pity and fear.
So one of the elements of the tragic figures is that they face uncommon suffering with uncommon dignity. The poet William Butler Yeats described the kind of tragedy such as King Lear as a terrible beauty, and even though it's a paradox, it gets right to the heart of the matter.
The terrible part is the extreme suffering the tragic figure faces. The beauty part is the dignity with which the tragic figure endures that extreme suffering.
My friends, when we see a tragedy and experience what the tragic figure experiences, we undergo a purging of emotions. That's what I call catharsis.
Why in the world would we be interested in seeing a human suffer so much? You know, why would we want to see what happens to King Lear? He goes mad, 2 of his daughters betray him, his best friend has his eyes gouged out, his youngest daughter dies, and then he dies at the end. I mean, it's just totally depressing, isn't it? All right, easy now. There's more to it than that. It's the beauty side again of Yeats' terrible beauty. We see King Lear fight and fight against all his suffering, maintaining his dignity in the face of great calamity. Throughout this process, we see the true measure of a man. And this is what impresses and moves us.
Let's review what we've learned. In art, tragedy is the imaginative depiction of the tragic figure. Tragic figures are noble figures who are better than we are. They suffer a reversal of fortune and recognize the consequences of their actions. The audience who watches these actions and their consequences is moved to pity and fear.
When we experience great tragedy in art, we are enlarged and ennobled because we've seen the magnitude of human suffering and the extent of human potential.
Okay, we can better understand Shakespeare as a writer of tragedies if we put his work in perspective. To do that, we'll look at what dramatic tragedy was like before Shakespeare. We'll discuss Oedipus Rex, an example of Greek tragedy, as well as tragedy during the Middle Ages. Let's start with the play Oedipus Rex.
Section B, Oedipus Rex, the height of Greek tragedy.
Let's talk about Oedipus. First off, you may have heard this guy's name pronounced Oedipus, but we pronounce it Oedipus. Why? Because we like it that way. Actually, it's because the pronunciation is more true to the Greek original. Oedipus Rex, a tragedy by the Greek playwright Sophocles, was first performed in the 5th century BC, about 2,000 years before Shakespeare was born. Great. But what does this have to do with Shakespeare? Well, we can use this play as a model, a prototype for what makes a great tragedy.
The story is well known. According to a prophecy, Oedipus is born destined to commit the most horrible of crimes. Is it running with scissors? No! Not refilling the ice cube tray? No again! He's destined to kill his father and marry his mother!
As the play opens, we watch as Oedipus, the king of thieves, deals with a plague that has struck his city. It turns out the city is cursed because the murder of a previous king has gone unsolved. The city will continue to suffer until the murderer is punished. So Oedipus investigates, and in so doing, he finds out some terrible facts about himself.
He realizes the people who raised him in Corinth aren't his real parents. Second, he realizes that in an earlier disagreement, he killed a man who was the king, his biological father. Third, he realizes the woman he married and had children with was his biological mother.
To repeat, Oedipus's own investigation into the murder of the previous king reveals that he is the murderer, and that this man was his father, and the woman he married was that guy's wife, which makes her his mother. How did all this happen?
Well, as a young man, after Oedipus was told by an oracle about the prophecy of his father killing and mother marrying tendencies, he vowed never to return to Corinth to see the people he thought were his parents. The only problem was, those guys weren't his parents. But Oedipus didn't know that. Anyway, he traveled far from his home, and one day he finds himself at a crossroads, arguing with a man about who has right of way. Well, things turn ugly, like most traffic incidents do. The man insults Oedipus, and Oedipus kills him. A little excessive, don't you think?
Well, Oedipus takes off and makes it to Thebes, where the citizens there are oppressed by this monster, the Sphinx.
The Sphinx is this weird creature with the body of a lion, these wings sticking out, and the face of a woman. She's terrorizing Thebes, and until someone answers her riddle, she will wreak havoc on the city.
Well, Oedipus, Mr. Smart Guy, answers the riddle. This frees Thebes from the plague, and the citizens are very happy. So happy, in fact, that they make Oedipus their king. And they let him marry their widowed queen, Jocasta.
All's well that ends well, right? We got this plague, remember? The plague that's hanging around because the murderer of the old king hasn't been punished? Well, the facts of Oedipus's investigation basically tell him this. Oedipus, you know that nice couple who raised you in Corinth? Well, they're not actually your parents. And you know that guy that you killed at the crossroads? Guess what? That was your dad, the king of Thebes. And Jocasta? Joe Mama.
Well, Oedipus is totally devastated when he learns this. He can't believe he's the guy who killed the former king, his father, and is responsible for the plague on Thebes. In his horror, he decides to punish himself by putting out his eyes with 2 long pins taken from Jocasta's robe.
For Oedipus, there is no relief from the agony of his situation. As the last lines of the play tell us, call no man fortunate who is not dead. The dead are free from pain.
This is a tragedy, all right, but why should we care? We've just witnessed the story of a man who, when finding out he killed his father and married his own mother, gouged his eyes out. That's not ennobling. That's just gross, right? Well, there's more to it than that.
We're exploring the depth of human suffering and the responses to that suffering. Oedipus's suffering and actions set him apart from us and make him worthy of study. Like with King Lear, we see a character maintaining his dignity in the face of great calamity, and through this process we see the true measure of the man.
Oedipus is responsible for his actions, even though they were prophesied. The prophecy did not cause Oedipus to kill his father and marry his mother. When Oedipus discovers the facts, he confronts them with courage and integrity.
What do we mean by courage and integrity? Well, Oedipus doesn't shrink from the knowledge of the horrible things he's done. He faces them, and by blinding himself, takes responsibility for his actions.
Let's examine Oedipus as a tragic figure by asking some key questions. Is he a mighty figure, someone who is better than us? Does he suffer a reversal of fortune? Does he endure uncommon suffering? Does he recognize the consequences of his actions? Does his plight ennoble and enlarge us? Let's take them one at a time.
Is he a mighty figure, someone who's better than us? Well, that Rex on the end of Oedipus isn't his nickname or anything. Rex means king, so we know Oedipus is the ruler of Thebes. Does he suffer a reversal of fortune? You bet. When the play opens, Oedipus is the king. By the end, he's banished from the city. That's a real 180-degree turnaround. Does he endure uncommon suffering? I would say that finding out you killed your father and married your mother qualifies as uncommon suffering. Next question. Does he recognize the consequences of his actions? Yes. He realizes he has brought the plague upon the city and punishes himself violently. Does his plight ennoble and enlarge us?
Well, that's the clincher, isn't it? Witnessing this story touches something deep inside us, that part of us that makes us human. Oedipus's experience hits us to the very core. A big reason his experience moves us is that for pure economy and tragedy, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex wins hands down.
What do we mean by economical, you ask? Well, there's nothing extra going on in the play. We do hear of Oedipus's personal history, but we only get it as he unravels the mystery. So the focus of the play is on Oedipus's self-discovery. Everything that happens in the play is crucial to the development of this one theme. You see, because we're along for the ride, we vicariously confront the same things Oedipus confronts, and in doing so, we've grown in our own understanding of what it means to be human to an extent we would not otherwise know. And such an encounter is ultimately transforming.
This intense experience both shatters and inspires us. It's a peculiar but extraordinary experience.
And that is why we can describe tragedy in art as a terrible beauty. We've discovered truths about the depths of the human soul. Now, this tragedy stuff can be difficult to get the hang of at first. That's because we're dealing with the limits of human potential. We see characters and situations we probably wouldn't even be able to deal with. But if we understand the story of Oedipus, we understand tragedy.
Okay, it's time for a little review of what we've learned about Sophocles' Greek play, Oedipus Rex. Due to its economical presentation and overall effect, Oedipus Rex is an excellent example of tragedy. The economical presentation is created because all of the play's events lead to Oedipus's realization of his horrible acts. The overall effect is devastating because we see Oedipus, the tragic figure, face his extreme suffering with courage and integrity. We'll leave ancient Greece now and move into the Middle Ages.
Section C, Tragedy in the Middle Ages.
After studying the tragedies of ancient Greece, We need to stop in the Middle Ages before making our way to Shakespeare and the English Renaissance. Let's look at the important tragic forms of the years between AD 500 and AD 1500, the time known as the Middle Ages.
These tragedies, or tragical tales, were really teaching stories rather than dramatic plays. One of the most influential of these is Boccaccio's De Casibus Rerorum Illustrium, which was written in Latin.
This book gave its name to a type of tragedy called a De Casibus tragedy. A medieval De Casibus tragedy has three main features.
1. These tales are in the form of narratives or stories rather than dramatic plays. 2. The fall or death of the main character, usually from a high position, was enough for the tale to be considered tragic. And 3. These tales were meant to teach the reader various lessons, for instance, humility or caution.
This form of tragedy continued into the 1500s, the most notable example in English being The Mirror for Magistrates, which was an immensely popular series of cautionary tales about the fall of famous English figures.
These narratives are warnings. They're kind of like they're telling us, you better watch it, buddy, I've got my eye on you. It was all about the Wheel of Fortune, a concept which was very popular with the Elizabethans.
The Wheel of Fortune.
You may be sailing along pretty good. Everything's fine. That's when you're at the top of the Wheel of Fortune. But it's just a matter of time before you fall, because that wheel just keeps on turning. Whoa! Then you're down here, at the bottom. And let me tell you, life stinks down here. Hey, Oedipus!
You know, it's a short step from the De Casibus tragedies to plays that Shakespeare wrote, like his history plays about the fall of kings, for instance, Richard II and Richard III. You know, since we've mentioned these two Shakespeare plays, let's dive in all the way and talk about what his tragedies are like.
Section D, Shakespeare and Tragedy.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
And thou, O shaking thunder, strike flat the thick rotundity of the world, crack nature's molds, all germain spill at once that makes ingrateful man. I am a man more sinned against than sinning.
Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
It is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. It is the cause.
Those are some of Shakespeare's best and most famous lines. Each of them are spoken by a tragic figure in one of the playwright's major tragedies, tragedies that have remained popular and affecting for hundreds of years.
Shakespeare, as a writer of tragedy, was very influenced by the kind of storytelling found in those Middle Ages De Casibus tragedies, discussed earlier. Shakespeare's tragedies reflect the theme of life as a pattern controlled by fortune.
Generally speaking, Shakespeare wrote 10 tragedies.
Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Timon of Athens.
Let's touch briefly on 6 of these tragedies. That way we can track Shakespeare's development as a tragedian.
We'll look at Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear.
Titus Andronicus was the first tragedy William Shakespeare ever wrote. Written around 1590, it's actually not that great of a tragedy.
That's right, even Shakespeare wrote mediocre stuff. The play is the 16th century equivalent of a slasher horror movie. It concerns this guy, Titus Andronicus, that has a bunch of bad stuff done to him and his family by the emperor, like decapitation, rape, and mutilation.
Well, Titus gets his revenge in a gruesome way, with several stabbings and more decapitations. Pretty gruesome, eh?
At this point, Shakespeare was just starting out as a playwright, and his command of theatrical conventions and poetry was still being perfected. You know what, though? Titus Andronicus was actually quite popular in its day.
Things improve a lot by the time of Shakespeare's next tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, written about 6 years after Titus Andronicus.
The second tragedy is the very famous and much-loved story of those star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet. Interestingly, Shakespeare took a plot structure, young lovers who try to overcome parental disapproval, that was more commonly found in comedies than tragedies.
And the playwright focused on the doomed love of the two main characters, rather than probing a single tragic figure's extreme suffering. For his major tragedies, Shakespeare never returned to the format he used in Romeo and Juliet. First off, the structure was straight tragedy, no comedy then tragedy setup. And he focused on just one tragic figure of mighty proportions, instead of two doomed lover types, except in Antony and Cleopatra. But Antony and Cleopatra are no Romeo and Juliet.
The next tragedy Shakespeare wrote, Hamlet, is probably the most famous tragedy ever written in the English language.
The play concerns the young Prince Hamlet, who must decide whether or not to avenge the murder of his father, the king. But Hamlet can't seem to act.
He thinks everything through, wondering about the ethical, moral, and spiritual consequences of his possible vengeance. Containing the full range of human emotions, Hamlet is a complex character in a complex play. Philosophical and cerebral, Hamlet is a thinking person's tragedy.
Othello, written around 1603, is a tragedy that rivals Sophocles' Oedipus Rex for sheer economy of plot. The emotional impact of Othello is stunning, as we follow the heartbreaking fall of a good man, destroyed by his obsessive jealousy.
Here Shakespeare really probes the suffering of his tragic figure Othello, creating a devastating effect on those who see or read the play.
The tragedy of Macbeth is much different. This play, written between 1603 and 1606, concerns the overly ambitious Scottish ruler, Macbeth, a man who destroys his soul to gain power.
Macbeth is an examination of evil from the inside. Shakespeare probes the conscience of a tragic figure who knows full well the consequences of his actions.
Macbeth can be considered Shakespeare's zenith as a writer of blank verse. The poetry in the play is extraordinary, and the characters, especially that of Macbeth, are very well drawn. All in all, it's a spooky, chilling play.
Our next play is King Lear. It was actually written before Macbeth, but many experts believe King Lear to be Shakespeare's crowning achievement in tragedy.
Sprawling, metaphoric, and poetic, this play is a grand fable, an almost fairy tale-like story of a king who exiles all those close to him, but through extreme suffering and ultimately madness, achieves redemption.
Coming after the experimentation and promise of Titus Andronicus and Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear are the height of Shakespeare's achievement as a tragedian. Each explore a variation on the theme of the tragic figure and his suffering. These time-tested plays are truly supreme examples of that unique work of art, the tragedy.
An important style of tragedy in the Middle Ages was the Decasibus tragedy, named after the book De Casibus Virorum Illustrium by Boccaccio. These tragedies had three main features. One, they were in the form of narratives rather than dramatic plays. Two, they involved the fall of the main character, usually from a high place. And third, they taught a basic moral lesson.
The Wheel of Fortune was a popular concept during the English Renaissance, and Shakespeare made use of this concept in his plays. Characters may be at the top of the wheel, experiencing good fortune, but eventually they will fall and wind up at the bottom of the wheel where they experience bad fortune.
Generally speaking, Shakespeare wrote 10 tragedies in his career. Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear are considered to be among the greatest tragedies ever written.
Well, Shakespeare fans, we've come to the end of our program. We hope that we've given you a good introduction to Mr. William Shakespeare and to tragedy, and that you've had some fun along the way.